two people could stand in the very same city, breathe the same air, walk the same streets, yet one moves through life pulled toward more. The other stays fixed in place, straining and never arriving. What separates them is not luck, it is not talent, it is not the accident of birth. It is something older than any bank, older than any nation, older than money itself. Ancient teachers in Egypt called it a hidden law of the mind. The philosophers of Rome called it the ordering current of the cosmos. And in a small, quiet manuscript written in 1910, a forgotten author called it simply the certain way. Right now, we uncover that law, slowly, completely. And by the end, you will not see money or effort or luck the same way again. There is a truth every advancing civilization has quietly agreed on, even when they agreed on nothing else. The Egyptians wrote it into their temple teachings. The Stoics of Rome carried it into their daily discipline. It resurfaces again and again, wearing different clothes in different centuries, in different tongues. The truth is this: abundance is not something you chase, it is something you align with. Not a prize to be won, a current to be entered. By the end of this journey, you will understand why two people with the same income can live entirely different lives, why effort alone has never made anyone rich, and why the smallest shift in how you think can change the direction of everything that follows. This is not a promise of magic. It is closer to a description of physics, the physics of attention, thought, and the substance beneath all things. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Right to Overflow. There is an old idea, still whispered in some corners of the world, that poverty is noble, that wanting more is somehow small or greedy or beneath a spiritual life. This idea has ruined more lives than any famine. No man ever unfolded the fullness of his mind while starving his body. No woman ever gave her deepest love to the world while exhausted by lack. To grow, in body, in mind, in spirit, requires resources, and resources require abundance. The desire for more is not a flaw in your character. It is the oldest instinct in the universe. Every living thing seeks to expand. A seed does not apologize for growing into a tree. Consider two brothers who once inherited adjoining plots of desert land. The first brother looked at his plot and said, "This land is cursed. Nothing grows here. I will simply endure it." He built a small hut, sat in its shade, and waited for rain that rarely came. The second brother looked at the same barren plot and said, "Water exists somewhere, even here, and I will find it." He dug. He failed. He dug again in a new place. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon his shovel struck damp earth, and beneath it a spring, old, hidden, patient, waiting only to be uncovered. Both brothers had the same land, the same sun, the same silence. Only one of them believed abundance was already there, buried, waiting for the will to reach it. The Stoic philosophers taught something similar, that the world does not owe you comfort, but it does contain, in abundance, everything needed for a well-lived life, if you are willing to work with its nature instead of against it. The Egyptian teachers went further still, describing the universe as fundamentally generous, endlessly producing, endlessly renewing, incapable of true scarcity, only of misdirected attention. Who then is truly poor? Not the man with little in his hands, the man who has stopped digging. You have a right to abundance, not as an indulgence, but as the very condition your growth requires. The soul that denies itself resources does not become holier, it simply becomes smaller. Overflow is not excess. Overflow is what allows you to give without emptying yourself first. Chapter 2. The Law Beneath the Chaos. If you watch closely, wealth does not distribute itself randomly. It follows a pattern, quiet, consistent, almost mathematical, though most people never notice it because they are too busy resenting its results. There is a way of doing things that produces increase, and a way that does not. This is not about intelligence. It is not about luck. It is about alignment. In one small village, 2 bakers opened shops across the street from one another. Same flour, same oven, same hours. Within a year, one baker's shop overflowed with customers each morning, while the others stood behind an empty counter, wondering why fortune had chosen his neighbor and not him. The villagers assumed it was the recipe. It wasn't. Both used their grandmother's bread. The difference was harder to see. The first baker greeted each customer as though their day mattered to him. He gave a little more than expected, an extra roll, a warm word, without calculating the cost. The second baker counted every crumb, suspicious that generosity would be his ruin, and his customers, sensing this quiet stinginess, drifted elsewhere without knowing exactly why. One baker operated from a law he never named. The other fought that law without knowing it existed. The ancient Hermetic teachers described the universe as fundamentally mental, that thought itself is a kind of raw material, shaping the world the way a sculptor's intention shapes marble long before the chisel ever touches stone. What a person believes about abundance, they said, becomes the invisible architecture of what that person builds. The Stoics called this same principle living according to nature, recognizing the order beneath events and cooperating with it rather than resisting it. Modern psychology, without the ancient language, describes something remarkably similar, that our expectations quietly shape our behavior in ways we rarely notice, and our behavior in turn shapes the results we get. Different centuries, different vocabularies, the same discovery. There is a certain way. Anyone can learn it. It does not require more talent than you already have. One baker feeds the pattern. The other starves it. Chapter 3. Nothing is owned. Everything is open. A common fear keeps people from ever beginning, the belief that opportunity is finite, that the good positions are taken, that the wealthy have already claimed everything worth claiming, and only scraps remain for everyone else. This fear is old, and it is almost entirely false. Picture a walled garden, tended for generations, its fruit trees heavy and its paths well worn. From inside the walls, it seems the whole world must look like this, finished, owned, complete. But climb the wall, and beyond it stretches land without end, untouched, unclaimed, not because no one wanted it, but because almost no one thought to look past the wall they'd been told was the edge of the world. Every generation believes its opportunities are exhausted. Every generation is wrong. New industries appear that did not exist a decade earlier. New needs arise that no one yet knows how to meet. The walls people fear are rarely as tall or as final as they appear from the inside. The Egyptian principle of correspondence taught that the visible world is only a reflection of unseen abundance, that what exists in material form is a small fraction of what remains possible, always renewing, never truly used up. The Stoics taught something adjacent, that a person's circumstances are far less fixed than their mind assumes, and that most walls people fear are walls of habit, not walls of stone. There is enough opportunity, enough resource, enough unclaimed ground for every person reading or listening right now to build something entirely their own without taking a single thing from anyone else. You are not competing for the last piece of a shrinking pie. You are standing at the edge of a garden wall, mistaking your own hesitation for a locked gate. Climb it. Chapter 4. The Mind That Shapes the World. Long before the sculptor lifts a single tool, the statue already exists, not in the stone, but in the mind that will one day cut it free. This is the oldest secret of creation. Form follows thought, not the reverse. An old teaching from Egypt held that the universe itself is fundamentally mental, that all visible form is the outward expression of an underlying intelligence ceaselessly thinking itself into shape. Stone becomes temple, seed becomes forest, thought becomes circumstance. You are not separate from this process. You are an instance of it. Every object you have ever owned first existed as an idea in someone's mind before it existed in your hand. The chair you sit in, the device carrying this voice to you now, all of it began as a thought, held long enough, clearly enough, to eventually take form. The question is not whether your thoughts create your circumstances. The question is only how clearly and how consistently you are willing to hold them. Consider the sculptor once more. He does not attack the marble in confusion, hoping something beautiful emerges by accident. He holds a single, unwavering image of the final form, and then works patiently in service of that image, removing only what does not belong. Most people do the opposite with their own lives. They hold no clear image at all, only a vague hope that things might improve, and then wonder why nothing takes shape. A clear mental picture is not daydreaming. It is the blueprint the rest of the process depends on. Without it, even the hardest work only produces rubble. Hold the image of what you want, the way the sculptor holds the vision of the statue, steadily, patiently, without apology, and the cutting away of what does not belong will follow. Chapter 5. The Hunger That Never Lies. There is a moment, almost universal in childhood, when a small child looks toward the horizon and asks to walk there, convinced that if they simply keep going, they will finally arrive at the place where the sky touches the earth. A parent, amused, explains that the horizon moves as you move. It cannot be reached. It can only be walked toward. The child, discouraged, sometimes stops walking altogether, mistaking an ever-receding horizon for proof that walking was pointless. But the parent misses something. The child was never truly chasing the horizon. The child was chasing motion itself, the pure, unfiltered desire to keep discovering what lies one step further. Desire is not a flaw to be corrected. It is life demonstrating its nature. Every living thing seeks to expand. A tree does not feel guilty for wanting more sunlight. A river does not apologize for wanting the sea. The Stoics understood desire as a signal of what a person's nature was oriented toward, not something to be shamed, but something to be understood and rightly directed. The wanting of more is not weakness. It is the exact mechanism by which life continues to unfold itself in you exactly as it does in the seed, the river, and the horizon-chasing child. Stop apologizing for wanting more. The hunger was never lying to you. Chapter 6. How the River Finds You. There once lived a lighthouse keeper on a rocky, distant coast who noticed something curious about his work. He did not chase the ships. He never once left his post to hunt for vessels lost in the fog. He simply kept the light burning steadily, night after night, and the ships came to him. This is the difference between the competitive mind and the creative one. The competitive mind believes wealth is a fixed pie, and survival means outmaneuvering others for a slice of it. The creative mind understands something quieter and far more powerful, that steady, honest value offered consistently draws its own return, without struggle, without scheming, without ever needing to chase. The lighthouse keeper did not compete with other lighthouses for ships. He simply became reliable enough that ships on their own adjusted course toward his light. This is how riches actually arrive, not stolen from someone else's ledger, but created and then drawn toward the person who has made themselves a dependable source of value. Ancient teachers across traditions converge here. The Egyptians spoke of maintaining right order so that what belongs to you naturally finds its way home. The Stoics spoke of tending one's character, trusting that external outcomes would follow in their own time. You do not need to chase the ships. You need only keep the light burning. Chapter 7. The Bridge Called Gratitude. There is an old well in a certain village that behaves in a way no engineer has ever been able to explain. The more water is drawn from it, gratefully, purposefully, the fuller it seems to become. And the more it is neglected, ignored, taken for granted, the more it seems to run dry, even in seasons of rain. The villagers have their own explanation, older than any of them. The well responds to attention, not water pressure. Attention. Whether or not you believe a well can behave this way, your own life behaves exactly like this. Gratitude is not a pleasant afterthought tacked on to success. It is the mechanism that keeps the channel open in the first place. Every tradition that has ever studied abundance arrives eventually at the same conclusion. Appreciation is not the reward for receiving. It is the condition that allows receiving to continue. The Stoics practiced a daily discipline of naming what they already had, precisely because they understood that attention, once trained on lack, multiplies lack, and attention, once trained on sufficiency, multiplies sufficiency. The ancient temple teachings described gratitude as a kind of tuning, bringing the individual mind into resonance with the greater intelligence of the universe, the way a struck tuning fork brings a silent one into vibration simply by proximity. Whatever language you prefer, the mechanism is the same. Dwell on what is missing, and your attention manufactures more evidence of missing. Dwell instead on what is already flowing toward you, however small, and the well, mysteriously, begins to fill. Draw from it daily, not because it is owed to you, because gratitude is the bridge, and nothing crosses to you without one. Chapter 8. The Picture Before the Proof. No building has ever risen from a construction site before it first existed on the architect's drawing table. This ordering is not optional. It is not possible to build well without first seeing clearly what is being built. Most people never get rich, not because they lack ability, but because they never draw the blueprint. They carry only a vague longing, "I wish things were better," which is not a plan. It is fog. A clear mental picture is different. It has details. It has texture. It knows what it is building, room by room, long before the first material arrives. An old story tells of an architect asked to design a home for a family who could describe only a feeling. "We want to feel safe. We want to feel warm." The architect refused to begin work until the family could describe rooms, windows, light, where the kitchen table would sit, and who would sit around it. Only once the vague feeling became a specific picture could anything be built. This is the discipline required of anyone seeking real increase. Not a wish, a picture held steadily, contemplated often, believed in fully, not as fantasy, but as a blueprint already quietly under construction. Faith here is not blind hope. It is the architect's certainty that a well-drawn plan, followed patiently, becomes a building. Draw the picture before you go looking for the proof. The proof only comes after. Chapter 9. The Will Turned Inward. A young rider once tried again and again to control a horse that did not belong to him. Pulling its reins from a distance, shouting commands it had never been trained to obey. The horse, confused and frightened, threw the rider hard into the dirt. An old trainer watching nearby offered a single piece of advice. You cannot will another creature's obedience. You can only train your own hands to hold the reins that actually belong to you. Most people misunderstand personal power entirely. They imagine it as force applied outward, onto other people, onto circumstances, onto the world, trying to bend it toward your wants through sheer insistence. But true will was never meant to be aimed outward. It was only ever meant to govern the one animal actually within your control, your own mind. The Stoics called this the only true freedom available to any person, not control over events, but complete authority over one's own attention, judgment, and response. Everything else, they taught, was simply not yours to command. Use your will, then, not to force wealth toward you by sheer effort or manipulation of others, but to keep your own mind steady, returning it again and again to the picture you have drawn, refusing to let doubt or distraction pull the reins from your hands. The horse that matters was always your own. Chapter 10. Standing Guard Over the Mind. A gardener once planted a single seed and, anxious for proof it was growing, dug it up every few days to check the roots. It never grew. Not because the seed was bad, because it was never left alone enough to become what it was already becoming. This is precisely how most people sabotage their own abundance. They plant an intention, a business, a goal, a change, and then dig it up daily with doubt. Is it working yet? What if it fails? What if I'm wrong? Each excavation, however small, disturbs the very growth it claims to be checking on. Guarding the mind does not mean pretending problems do not exist. It means refusing to make lack the object of your daily attention. What you study, you tend to become. Study scarcity, and scarcity roots deeper. Study the picture you are building, and that picture roots deeper instead. This single discipline, the refusal to keep exhuming buried seeds out of anxiety, separates those who eventually harvest something from those who spend a lifetime holding empty, upturned soil in their hands, wondering why nothing ever grew. Bury the doubt. Leave it buried. Water only the picture. Chapter 11. Now is the only door. A man once owned a small boat badly in need of repair, and told himself, quite reasonably, that he would fix it once the tide changed, once conditions were more favorable, once the sea grew calmer. The tide changed many times over many years. The boat was never repaired. It simply grew older and less seaworthy, waiting for a moment of perfect readiness that never quite arrived. There is no perfect tide. There is only the boat in front of you today, in whatever condition it happens to be in. Every tradition that has studied achievement arrives at the same uncomfortable truth. The present moment is the only moment in which anything has ever actually been built. Not the past, which no longer exists to act upon. Not the future, which does not yet exist to act upon. Only now. This does not mean acting recklessly or without thought. It means refusing to postpone the small present actions available to you today while waiting for a future that will never arrive already finished. Whatever business you are in now, whatever role you currently occupy, that is the boat in front of you. Repair it now with the tools you already have, and the better tide, when it comes, will find a vessel actually ready to meet it. Chapter 12. The Weight You Are Made to Carry. 2 woodcutters once worked the same forest, felling trees for the same wage. The first worked in a hurry, swinging hard, working long hours, exhausted by nightfall, his cuts jagged and uneven, wasting half the wood he felled through careless splitting. The second worked at a slower pace, but with total attention. Each swing placed exactly, each log split cleanly, nothing wasted. By evening, though he had swung his axe far fewer times, his pile of usable timber was nearly double the first man's. The forest did not reward effort. It rewarded precision. This is the quiet mistake behind most exhausted, unrewarded labor, mistaking motion for progress. Doing more, hurried and scattered, produces less than doing less, but doing it completely. Every task placed in front of you today, however small, however unremarkable, is either done with your full attention or it is not. There is no in-between that produces real increase. You are not required to do everything. You are required to do what is in front of you today, fully, and to leave the rest for tomorrow's attention. This alone, not raw hours, not frantic effort, is what steadily accumulates into a life that outgrows its former limits. Chapter 13. The Current You Become. There is a mountain spring that never seems to run dry, even in the driest seasons, while nearby wells, fed by the same underground water table, slowly empty and crack in the sun. The difference, hydrologists eventually discovered, was almost poetic. The spring never stopped moving. Because it constantly gave its water outward, fresh water was continually drawn in behind it, pulled from deep reserves the stagnant wells never accessed at all. The wells that hoarded emptied. The spring that gave replenished. This is the final secret, and perhaps the most important one. Abundance is not something you accumulate and then protect. It is something you become a channel for. Every person you deal with, in business, in friendship, in the smallest daily exchange, either senses that you are a source of increase or senses that you are guarding a shrinking pile, afraid to let any of it move. People are drawn, instinctively, to the first kind of person and quietly repelled by the second, often without knowing exactly why. You do not need vast wealth to become a spring instead of a well. You only need to stop hoarding what little water you already have and let it move. Through generosity, through genuine value given freely, through the simple, steady conviction that more is always flowing in behind what you give away. Become the current. Do not merely search for it.
Chapter 14. The Vocation That Fits Like a Key. An old orchard keeper once tried for 3 seasons running to graft a delicate pear branch onto the trunk of a wild, bitter apple tree. He worked carefully. He was patient. He followed every technique he knew. The graft never took. The two were simply not suited to each other, no matter how skillfully he bound them together. In frustration, he tried the same pear branch on a young, related pear rootstock nearby, one he had almost overlooked, thinking it too ordinary to matter. Within a single season, the graft fused seamlessly. By the following spring, it was already bearing fruit. The branch had not changed. Its potential had not changed. Only the ground it was joined to had changed, and that single difference was the whole story. Most people spend years forcing their effort onto ground that will never receive it, then conclude, wrongly, that the effort itself was the problem. It rarely is. More often, the graft was simply made in the wrong place. The Stoics taught that each person carries a particular nature, and that a well-lived life comes from understanding that nature honestly and acting in accordance with it, not in defiance of it. The Egyptian teachers spoke of each soul carrying its own proper function, like a single note in a larger harmony, out of tune only when forced to play a note that was never its own. This does not mean abandoning effort at the first sign of difficulty. Every worthwhile graft requires patience, and even the right pairing takes a season to fuse. But there is a difference between the ordinary strain of honest growth and the endless, fruitless strain of forcing a branch onto ground that was never going to receive it. Ask, honestly, is this simply difficult, the way any true growth is difficult, or is this the wrong tree entirely? Find the ground that receives you. The graft that belongs will take root far faster than the one you have been forcing for years.
Chapter 15. The Weight of Comparison. Two climbers once set out on the same morning to summit two different mountains, standing side by side across a single valley. The first climber kept his eyes on the rock in front of him, testing each hold, pacing his breath, adjusting to his own mountain's particular terrain. The second climber could not stop glancing sideways, watching the other man's progress across the valley, measuring every one of his own steps against a summit that was never his to reach in the first place. He sped up when the other pulled ahead. He grew discouraged when the other found an easier path. Distracted, misjudging his own holds, he slipped on ground he would have crossed easily had his attention been where his feet actually were. Comparison is a peculiar kind of theft. It does not take your resources, it takes your attention. And attention, as we've already seen, is the very thing abundance depends on. Every path holds a different mountain, a different terrain, a different pace. The person who built wealth in half your time may have started on entirely different ground, with different winds at his back, or storms you never saw him weather. His summit was never a fair measure of your climb. The Stoics practiced a discipline of attending only to what was within their own control, their effort, their judgment, their next handhold, precisely because they understood how easily the mind drains itself watching mountains that belong to someone else. There is a quiet freedom available the moment you stop glancing sideways, not indifference to others' progress. Simple admiration costs nothing, but the firm return of your attention to your own rock, your own breath, your own next step. Climb your mountain. It was never a race against the man across the valley.
Chapter 16. When the ladder breaks. A merchant once organized a great caravan
months in the planning, to carry goods to a distant city where a lucrative deal awaited him. 3 days from departure, a violent storm washed out the mountain pass, the only route available, and the entire journey collapsed before it began. He was furious. Weeks of preparation undone by weather he could not have predicted or controlled. He learned, nearly a year later, that the city he had been traveling toward had fallen to a terrible plague only weeks after his caravan would have arrived, a plague that claimed the very merchants he had planned to trade with, along with most of their goods, their warehouses, and their fortunes. Had the storm not turned him back, he would have arrived directly into that collapse. What felt in the moment like total failure had actually been a redirection, one his limited view could not possibly have recognized as protection, because protection rarely announces itself as such. It simply looks, at first, like loss. This is not a promise that every disappointment secretly hides a gift. Some setbacks are simply setbacks. But it is worth remembering how often what feels like the ladder breaking beneath you is from a wider view you do not yet have access to, the very thing that kept you from climbing somewhere you were never meant to be. The Egyptian teachers spoke of a larger order moving beneath visible events, patient and rarely explaining itself in the moment it acts. The Stoics taught something almost identical, that events themselves are neutral, and it is only the mind's premature judgment of them before the whole picture is visible that turns a redirection into a tragedy. When the ladder breaks beneath you, resist the urge to declare immediately what it means. Grieve what needs grieving. Then keep walking. The wider view has the habit of arriving later than the disappointment does. Chapter 17. The Discipline of the Unseen Hour. In a small mountain monastery, a single monk was responsible for a great bell, rung only on rare occasions, a death, a warning, a celebration that might come once a decade. Every single morning, whether or not the bell would ring that year, he climbed the tower, checked the ropes, oiled the mechanism, and inspected the bronze for cracks. Visitors sometimes asked why he bothered, given how rarely the bell was actually used. He answered the same way each time. The bell does not care how rarely it rings. It only cares whether it is ready on the one morning that matters. Years later, when a fire swept toward the village in the night, that bell rang clearly, instantly, exactly when it was needed, because of 10,000 unseen mornings no one had ever witnessed or applauded. Most transformation happens exactly like this, in the unseen hour, the private discipline no one is watching, the ordinary morning that seems to matter to no one but you. The public result, when it finally arrives, is simply the visible tip of an enormous invisible foundation. The Stoics rose before dawn for this precise reason, tending their character in private, long before the world ever had occasion to test it. What you rehearse when no one is measuring you becomes, quietly, the thing you can rely on the one day everyone is. You do not need an audience for the work that matters most. You only need the willingness to climb the tower again tomorrow, whether or not the bell rings today. Chapter 18. The debt you cannot repay except forward. A poor boy once crossed a wide river on the back of an old ferryman's boat, having no coin to pay the fare. The old man waved off his apology and carried him across anyway, saying only, "Pass it on when you're able." Decades later, that boy, now grown and himself a ferryman on the very same river, searched for the old man to finally repay the debt, only to learn he had passed away many years earlier. For a while this troubled him deeply. The debt, it seemed, could never be settled. Then one morning a poor traveler stood at his dock with no coin, and the ferryman understood, all at once, exactly how the debt was meant to be repaid. Not backward, to the man who could no longer receive it. Forward, to whoever stood at the water's edge next. This is the true nature of increase. It does not move in circles, repaying itself neatly to its original source. It moves forward, through whoever is willing to carry it onward, gathering strength with each new hand it passes through. Every tradition that has studied generosity arrives at some version of this same insight, that what flows through you was never meant to be hoarded, or even repaid in the direction it came from, but simply kept moving, the way the ferryman's boat keeps moving, carrying whoever needs to cross. You may never be able to repay everyone who has carried you this far. You are not required to. You are only required to carry the next traveler standing at your own dock. Chapter 19. The Fear That Masquerades as Caution. A young swimmer once stood at the edge of a lake for 3 entire summers, insisting each year that she was simply not yet ready, that she needed one more season of watching, one more season of preparing before finally entering the water. Meanwhile, children half her age waded in clumsily, swallowed water, coughed, flailed, and by the end of that very first summer were swimming with an easy, unthinking confidence she still did not have 3 years later. She had not been cautious, she had been afraid, and had simply given the fear a more respectable name. There is a real and necessary kind of preparation, study, planning, honest assessment. But there is also a counterfeit version of preparation, whose only real purpose is to postpone the moment of actually getting wet. It disguises itself well. It sounds responsible. It even sounds wise. The difference is simple, if uncomfortable to admit. Real preparation has an end date. Counterfeit preparation never quite does. There is always one more course, one more book, one more season of watching from the shore before you'll finally be ready. The Stoics warned against exactly this, mistaking endless deliberation for virtue when in truth, right action delayed indefinitely is simply another form of avoidance dressed in more comfortable clothing. At some point, the swimming itself is the only remaining lesson left to learn, and it cannot be learned from the shore. Enter the water. You will flail. You will swallow some of it. And within a single season, you will be doing, easily, what felt impossible to even approach a year before. Chapter 20. The Quiet Room Inside You. A king once ruled over vast treasuries, more gold than he could count, and yet paced his palace most nights, unable to sleep, haunted by a hunger no acquisition ever seemed to satisfy. An old monk passing through the kingdom was granted an audience. The king expected advice about investments or alliances or new lands to acquire. Instead, the monk led him to a small, entirely bare room in the palace. No gold, no furnishings, nothing at all, and told him simply to sit there daily for 1 quiet hour. The king thought this absurd. He tried it anyway, if only out of curiosity. His fortune did not change in that room, but something else did. For 1 hour each day, the endless calculating, comparing, and craving simply went quiet, and in that quiet, for the first time in years, he began making decisions from clarity instead of hunger. His kingdom, strangely, began to flourish more than it ever had while he chased its growth directly, not because the quiet room produced gold, because the quiet room produced a mind no longer scattered by its own noise, and a settled mind, it turns out, makes far better decisions than an anxious one ever could. Every tradition we've walked through together in this journey eventually arrives here, at this same quiet room. The Stoics called it the inner citadel, the one place circumstance could never fully reach. The Taoist sages described a deep stillness beneath the surface of a busy mind, always available, rarely visited. You do not need a palace to find this room. You need only a few quiet minutes daily in which nothing is being acquired, calculated, or chased, only rested in. This is not separate from abundance. It is the ground abundance is actually built on. Chapter 21. The Long Field. An old farmer, well into his final years, spent one entire spring planting a young orchard of walnut trees, trees that would not bear their first real harvest for over a decade, long after his own working years, and quite possibly long after his life. A neighbor, watching him plant tree after tree with such evident care, asked why he bothered, given he would likely never taste a single walnut from that field. The old farmer straightened, considered the question, and answered simply, "Someone planted the trees I've eaten shade under my whole life. I never asked their names. I only knew to be grateful and to keep planting." This is the current followed all the way to its furthest, quietest end. Not a transaction, completed and closed within your own lifetime. A field planted in trust, tended by whoever comes next, long after the planter's own hands are done with the work. Every idea we've walked through together, the vision held clearly, the gratitude that keeps the well full, the current you become, rather than merely search for, eventually points past your own immediate need toward a field wider and longer than any single life. You will not finish everything you plant. No one ever has. That was never actually the measure of a life well lived. Plant anyway. The shade was never really for you alone. Chapter 22. The River That Refused a Straight Line. Engineers once tried to tame a wild, winding river by forcing it into a straight concrete channel, convinced that a direct path would move water faster, more efficiently, more under control. Instead, the floods grew worse. The straightened river, robbed of its natural bends, gathered speed and force it had never carried before, and hurled that force directly at the towns downstream. Years later, a different team removed the concrete and allowed the river to meander again, curve by curve, the way it had for centuries before anyone thought to correct it. The floods eased. The land around it, oddly, grew more fertile than it had in the straightened years. The river had never needed to be forced. It needed to be trusted. Much of the anxious effort people pour into their own lives works exactly like that concrete channel, an attempt to force a natural process into a rigid, controlled shape, convinced that force alone will produce speed. More often, it only produces pressure, and pressure eventually breaks something downstream. The Taoist sages spoke often of this same principle, that the softest, most yielding things frequently outlast and outwork the hardest, most forceful ones, simply by moving in accordance with what is already there instead of against it. This is not an argument for passivity. The river still moves. It still carves, still shapes the land around it, still reaches the sea, but it does so by working with its own nature, not by being forced into someone else's idea of the shortest distance. Where in your own life have you been pouring concrete around something that only ever needed room to bend? Chapter 23. The Guarded Gate. A young vineyard keeper once planted rows of delicate new vines, and before anything else built a low wooden wall around them. Not tall, not imposing, simply enough to keep grazing animals from wandering in and trampling the young shoots before they had grown strong enough to withstand it. Neighbors sometimes questioned the wall. Wasn't it a little precious, a little overprotective for something as ordinary as grapevines? He answered simply, "A mature vine can survive almost anything. A young one can be destroyed by a single careless hoof." Years later, once the vines had thickened into old sturdy wood, he removed the wall entirely. It was no longer needed. The vines could withstand now what would have destroyed them in their first season. This is a discipline rarely discussed in conversations about abundance, though it is just as essential as any of the others. Guarding what is still young in you. A new vision, a new belief in your own increase is exactly in the way a new vine is delicate. Easily trampled by a careless remark, a cynical relative, a stream of pessimistic voices you didn't choose to let in. This is not a call to isolate yourself permanently, or to refuse all outside opinion. It is simply a season, a wall raised temporarily around what is still tender until it has grown strong enough to stand in open ground. Protect the young vine. Remove the wall once it no longer needs one. Chapter 25. The Coin That Multiplied by Standing Still. Two investors once began, on the very same day, with the very same modest sum of money. The first chased quick returns, a promising tip here, an urgent opportunity there, moving his money again and again toward whatever looked fastest. He was rarely wrong for long, but he was rarely right for long either. And the constant movement, the constant fees and false starts, quietly ate away at what should have grown. The second did something almost boring by comparison. He chose a small number of solid, steady positions, added to them consistently, and then largely left them alone, resisting every temptation to chase the louder, faster-looking opportunities his friend kept describing at dinner. 10 years later, the difference between them was not small, it was enormous. Not because the second investor had been smarter in any single decision, because he had allowed the quiet, unglamorous force of steady accumulation to work uninterrupted for a decade. Compounding is a patient force. It rewards those who leave it alone far more than it rewards those who constantly interfere with it, convinced that more movement must mean more progress. The old teachers understood this long before modern finance gave it a name. Slow, steady increase, protected from constant disturbance, outperforms fast, erratic effort almost every time. Not because it moves quicker, but because it is rarely undone by its own impatience. Choose the slower coin. Then have the discipline to leave it standing still. Chapter 25. The Company the Field Keeps. A farmer once noticed something curious along the edge of two neighboring wheat fields. His own crop, planted beside a well-tended, thriving neighbor's field, grew unusually strong along that shared border. Richer grain, sturdier stalks, as though something had passed quietly between the two fields. The seed he planted had been identical on both sides. The difference was entirely in what surrounded it. People are not so different from wheat in this particular way. Whatever surrounds you daily, the conversations, the assumptions, the quiet expectations of the people nearest you, drifts across the border into your own thinking, whether you notice it happening or not. This is not a call to abandon anyone. It is simply an honest acknowledgement. The field beside you matters. Spend most of your time near scarcity thinking, and some of that thinking will drift, unnoticed, into your own soil. Spend it near people who believe, genuinely, in growth and possibility, and that belief tends to cross the border too. Choose your borders with some care. You cannot always choose who is planted beside you, but where you do have a choice, it is worth making deliberately. Chapter 26. The Teacher Who Grew Richer by Giving Away Knowledge. A master craftsman once refused to teach his methods to anyone, convinced that every apprentice he trained would only become a future competitor, quietly stealing customers he had spent a lifetime earning. His business, guarded so tightly, stayed small, steady, but small. A younger craftsman in a nearby town did the opposite. He taught openly, generously, training dozens of apprentices over the years, holding nothing back. Many of them did eventually open their own shops. But something unexpected happened. Each of those former apprentices spoke of their teacher with genuine respect, sent him the jobs too large or too specialized for their own shops, and carried his name and his methods into towns he had never personally visited. His reputation grew wider than his own two hands could ever have carried it alone. The guarded craftsman stayed small because he mistook knowledge for a finite resource, something diminished by sharing. The generous one understood something closer to the truth, that certain kinds of wealth multiply precisely because they are given away, rather than despite it. This does not mean every piece of knowledge should be shared indiscriminately, or that discernment has no place. But the instinct to hoard what you know out of fear that teaching it will somehow shrink you is very often exactly backward. What you teach freely has a way of returning to you, carried by hands you never expected, into places you never personally reached. Chapter 27. The Voice at Your Own Table. A talented chef once received glowing praise from nearly every guest who dined at his restaurant evening after evening. And yet, at the end of each night, he could recall almost none of it. Only the one imagined critical voice at the back of his own mind, informing him, dish after dish, exactly where he had fallen short. The praise was real. The criticism mostly was not, at least not from anyone actually present. It came from somewhere inside him, wearing the voice of every doubtful teacher, every dismissive relative, every early failure he had never quite set down. One evening an old mentor gave him strange advice. Set an extra place at your own table tonight, in your mind, and seat that voice directly across from you. Let it speak. Then simply thank it for its concern and go on serving the meal anyway. He tried it, expecting nothing. To his surprise, the voice, once acknowledged rather than fought outright, grew quieter far faster than it ever had when he tried to silence it outright. This is often the final, most stubborn obstacle standing between a person and their own increase. Not the market, not opportunity, even luck, but a single seat at their own table that has gone unaddressed for years. You do not have to defeat that voice in open combat. You only have to stop setting it at the head of the table and start seating it politely somewhere it no longer controls the whole meal.
Chapter 28. The Harvest That Was Never Yours Alone. An old vintner, in the final years of a long and celebrated career, stood one evening in the vineyard his grandfather had first planted, tasting a wine widely regarded as the finest of his life's work. He understood something clearly that evening that he had only half understood in his younger, hungrier years. The soil beneath his finest vines had been improved patiently by 2 generations before his own, tended, corrected, enriched by hands that would never taste a single glass of what that soil eventually produced. His harvest, however fine, was never entirely his own. It was the furthest visible point of a current that had been moving long before he arrived, and would need to keep moving long after he was gone. That evening he set aside a portion of his own harvest, not to sell, not to keep, but to reinvest directly into the soil itself, for whichever hands would tend that vineyard once his own grew still. This is where every idea in this journey finally arrives if you follow it far enough. The picture held clearly, the gratitude that kept the well full, the current you learned to become instead of merely search for. All of it, in the end, was never meant to terminate in you. It was only ever meant to pass through you, a little richer for the passing, on its way to whoever comes next. Taste your own harvest fully. You have earned that. But set some of it back into the soil before you're done. Chapter 29. The Inherited Ledger. A young woman once found, tucked in the back of a drawer after her grandmother's passing, an old worn ledger book. Decades of tight, careful entries, every expense accounted for, every small indulgence noted with a kind of quiet guilt in the margins. It was not simply a record of money, it was a record of fear, passed down so quietly that no one in the family had ever quite named it as fear. They had called it practicality, common sense, the way things are done. She began keeping her own ledger not long after, and noticed uncomfortably how many of her grandmother's old fears had slipped unexamined into her own handwriting,
the same guilt over small indulgences, the same bracing for disaster that had never actually arrived. She made a decision that surprised even her. She would keep some of what she'd inherited, the discipline, the honest accounting, the respect for what she had. But she would close out the fear as its own separate entry, deliberately, the way you'd finally settle an old debt that had quietly been accruing interest for too long. Every family passes down a ledger like this, whether spoken aloud or not. Beliefs about money absorbed so early and so wordlessly that most people mistake them for their own conclusions rather than someone else's inheritance. You are permitted to audit that ledger. Keep what serves you, close the rest out deliberately, and start a new page in your own hand.
Chapter 30. The Amplifying Mirror. Two brothers once inherited on the very same day an equally large and unexpected fortune from a distant relative. The first brother, who had always been generous even with little, became more generous still, funding a struggling neighbor's business, quietly covering a friend's medical bills, giving with the same open hand he'd always had, simply with more behind it now. The second brother, who had always been anxious about scarcity even when he had enough, became more anxious still, hoarding, suspicious of everyone's motives, tightening his grip on a fortune that, by any reasonable measure, he could never have spent in several lifetimes. The money had not created either man's character. It had only made what was already there impossible to miss. This is worth remembering by anyone chasing increase as though it were a solution to some deeper unease. Wealth does not repair what is broken in a person. It magnifies what is already present, generosity into greater generosity, fear into greater fear, exactly as a mirror reflects more clearly the closer you stand to it. If the current is going to carry more toward you, it is worth asking honestly what exactly it will be amplifying once it arrives. Chapter 31. Small Breaks, Not One Big One. An old locksmith spent years training an eager young apprentice, who kept waiting, impatiently, for the day he would finally learn the one master technique that unlocked everything. There was no such technique. There was only a slow accumulation of 100 small adjustments. How to read the particular resistance of a worn tumbler. How to feel the almost imperceptible give of a mechanism close to yielding. Small corrections made and remade across thousands of ordinary locks. One afternoon, the apprentice finally opened a stubborn, ancient lock that had defeated him for weeks, and turned to his teacher, triumphant, certain he'd finally found the master technique. The old locksmith smiled and shook his head. There was no single technique in that lock. There were 40 small things you'd been quietly learning for 2 years, all arriving at once. It only looked sudden from where you were standing. Most stories of overnight success work exactly this way, however they are told afterward. The public sees the lock finally opening and assumes, understandably, that some single dramatic key must have caused it. What they rarely see is the accumulation of small, unglamorous adjustments made in private for years beforehand, none of them individually impressive, all of them quietly necessary. Do not wait for the one big break. Keep making the small adjustments. The lock will eventually give, and from the outside it will look sudden, but you will know better.
Chapter 32. The Evening Reckoning. An old sea captain, famed for reaching ports others considered impossible, kept a single unremarkable habit throughout his entire career. Every night, before sleep, regardless of how the day's weather had gone, he sat alone with his charts, reviewed exactly how far the ship had traveled, and set, with quiet, deliberate care, the precise heading for the following morning. Some nights, storms had pushed him badly off course. He did not dwell there. He simply noted the true position honestly, adjusted the heading calmly, and closed the chart for the night. Sailors who served under him remarked that he never seemed anxious about the distance still ahead, however far it stretched. He had learned long before they joined his crew that a single quiet hour each evening, honestly reviewing the day and calmly resetting tomorrow's direction, mattered more than any single day's weather ever could. This is a fitting practice to close a long day on, and a fitting practice to close this journey on as well. Before sleep tonight, take a few unhurried minutes. Notice honestly and without harshness where today actually carried you. Feel gratitude for whatever ground was covered, however small, and quietly picture tomorrow's heading, not with urgency, but with the same calm certainty as the old captain closing his chart for the night. The ship does not need to arrive tonight. It only needs its heading reset before it rests. Chapter 33. The Applause That Isn't Required. A gifted violinist, long after the concert hall had emptied and the last patrons had gone home for the evening, remained alone on the stage, quietly working through a difficult passage that had troubled him throughout the performance. There was no one left to hear him, no applause waiting at the end, and yet he played the passage again and again, correcting a phrasing only he would ever have noticed, entirely for its own sake. Something settled in him that evening that no ovation had ever quite given him. A steadiness, a confidence rooted in the work itself, rather than in whoever happened to be watching it. Much of the anxious striving that exhausts people on their way toward increase comes from an unexamined need for an audience, for the validation, the recognition, the visible proof that the effort was worthwhile. This need is not shameful. It is simply exhausting, because audiences are unreliable, and their approval was never actually where the real steadiness comes from. The old teachers, across every tradition this journey has drawn from, pointed toward the same quiet discipline. Build the thing well, because it deserves to be built well, whether or not anyone claps. The applause, when it eventually comes, becomes a pleasant addition, not the foundation everything else was anxiously waiting on. Play the passage again tonight, for its own sake. The empty hall does not diminish the music. It simply proves, quietly, that the music was never really about the hall at all. Chapter 34. The Unseen Network. A traveler once crossed an unfamiliar country with almost nothing, a small bag, a little food, and a journey still far from finished. Along the way, a stranger gave him shelter for a single cold night, asking nothing in return. Another pointed him toward a safer road he would never have found alone. A third shared a meal without a second thought. He never saw any of them again. He never learned most of their names. Years later, settled and prosperous, He tried to trace back exactly how he had arrived where he was, and found the path impossible to draw cleanly. It ran through a dozen strangers' small, unremarkable kindnesses, none of them individually decisive, all of them quietly necessary. Every success, looked at honestly, runs through a network like this, mostly invisible, rarely thanked, made up of people who will never fully know how their small contribution mattered. The teacher who said one encouraging sentence at the right moment, the stranger who made one introduction, the customer who recommended you once in passing to someone you never met. This is worth remembering both in gratitude and in practice. Gratitude because so little of what arrives to you was built by your effort alone, and in practice because you are, right now, someone's unseen stranger on the road, capable of offering shelter for a night or pointing toward a safer path to someone who may never learn your name either. The network runs in both directions. Receive from it honestly. Contribute to it just as freely. Chapter 35. The Weight of a Promise Kept. A small merchant, generations ago, once made a simple promise to a struggling customer to replace a faulty tool at no cost, no questions asked, though he was under no real obligation to do so. That single kept promise cost him little, but it was remembered and repeated and passed down through that family for decades, long after the merchant himself had died, long after the tool itself had been forgotten. When his grandson later opened a shop in the very same town, customers arrived at his door already trusting him, based on nothing more than a promise kept 2 generations earlier. Trust compounds in a way remarkably similar to money, and often more powerfully. A single kept promise, honored even when it cost something, is remembered far longer and repaid far more generously than almost any single transaction ever could be. The reverse is equally true and far more quietly costly. A single broken promise, even a small one, tends to be remembered longer than 100 kept ones, which is precisely why integrity, in the driest and most practical sense, functions as one of the highest-yielding investments available to anyone, regardless of how much capital they currently hold. You may not see the return on a kept promise for years, or even in your own lifetime. Keep it anyway. Someone, somewhere down the line, is quietly keeping count. Chapter 36. The Season You're In. A young farmer once stood in his fields one bleak winter morning, staring at bare, frozen ground, entirely convinced that something had gone badly wrong. Nothing grew, nothing moved. The entire field looked, to his eyes, like failure. An old farmer passing by paused, studied the same field, and said only, "This is not failure. This is winter. The roots are working exactly as hard right now as they will in June. You simply can't see it from up here." Growth is not always visible while it is happening. Some of the most important work of any season, financial, personal, or otherwise, happens entirely below the surface, in root systems no one, including you, can inspect directly. Mistaking a dormant season for a failed one is one of the most common ways people abandon a path just before it would have borne fruit. The winter field looks identical to a dead one. The only real difference is what continues unseen beneath the frozen surface. The old teachers understood seasons as a discipline, not merely a metaphor. Each one necessary, none of them permanent, none of them, including the barren ones, actually wasted. If you are standing in a winter field right now, take the old farmer's word for it. The roots are still working. You simply can't see them from up here. Chapter 37. The Final Threshold. Every path we have walked together in this journey eventually arrives at the same last quiet threshold. Not a technique, not a strategy, but a simple willingness to actually cross over from thinking about increase to living inside it. A traveler can study maps for years, memorize every road, understand every landmark in exquisite detail, and still never leave the house. At some point, understanding the journey and beginning the journey become two entirely different things, and only one of them actually moves you anywhere. You have by now walked through the vision held clearly, the gratitude that keeps the well full, the will turned inward, the current you become rather than merely search for. None of it requires anything further from you to understand. It only requires now the willingness to step across the threshold and begin walking it. The door was never locked. It was only ever waiting for you to place your hand on it. Chapter 38. The Muscle Grows in the Rest. A young athlete once trained relentlessly, convinced that more effort applied constantly, without pause, was the only honest path to strength. He lifted every day. He rested rarely, viewing rest as a kind of quiet failure, time stolen from the only thing that seemed to matter. His progress oddly stalled. Then it began to reverse. His body, worn down without ever being allowed to recover, grew weaker rather than stronger, no matter how hard he pushed against it. And old Coach finally explained something he had never been told. The muscle does not actually grow during the lift. It grows afterward, in the quiet hours of rest, as the body repairs and reinforces what the effort had broken down. The lift creates the demand. The rest is where the increase actually happens. He began, reluctantly at first, building deliberate rest into his training, and within weeks made more progress than he had in the previous exhausting months combined. This principle reaches far beyond the gym. Growth, in almost any form, follows the same rhythm. A period of demand, followed by a period of recovery, in which the actual increase quietly takes place, unseen and unglamorous. A mind pushed constantly without rest does not become sharper, it becomes brittle. A body driven without recovery does not become stronger, it becomes injured. If you are exhausted right now, this is not evidence that you are falling behind. Rest is not the interruption of your progress. For a great many things worth building, it is the very mechanism by which progress actually occurs. Let this hour be part of the lift, not a break from it. Chapter 39. The Lantern You Carry Forward. An old lamplighter once walked the same route each evening, lighting a long row of street lamps one by one, so that travelers arriving at dark would find their way safely through town. He never met most of those travelers. He rarely saw the paths made easier by his work. He simply lit each lamp, night after night, trusting that the light would matter to someone, even without witnessing it himself. Everything this journey has walked through together, the vision held clearly, the gratitude that kept the well full, the will turned only ever inward, the current become rather than merely chased, eventually becomes exactly this, a lantern carried forward, lighting a little more of the path than you found it. You will not see every traveler who crosses safely because a lamp was lit. That was never the measure of whether the lighting mattered. Carry the lantern anyway. Light the next lamp on your own quiet route tonight, and again tomorrow. The current was always moving through you long before you learned its name, and it will keep moving long after this particular lantern has been passed to someone else's hand.
Chapter 40. The Room Still Being Built. A family once moved into a house before it was entirely finished, the frame complete, the roof sound, but several rooms still bare, unpainted, waiting for a final touch that hadn't arrived yet. Visitors sometimes apologized on their behalf, assuming the family must be embarrassed by the unfinished rooms. The family never seemed to be. They simply said, without any defensiveness at all, "That room is still being built. Come back next year and see it then." There was no shame in it, only patience and a kind of quiet confidence that the room would in fact be finished in its own time, without needing to be rushed into looking complete before it actually was. Most people carry at least one room like this in their own life, a goal not yet reached, a habit not yet settled, an old fear not yet fully cleared out. It is tempting to treat these unfinished rooms as evidence of failure, something to hide from visitors, something to apologize for. But an unfinished room is not a failed room. It is simply a room still being built exactly as it should be at this particular stage of construction. The frame is sound. The roof holds. The rest is simply a matter of time, attention, and the same patient, steady current this entire journey has been describing. You do not need every room finished tonight. You only need to keep building the one currently under your hands, trusting the rest will be reached in its own good time. Let the house stand, unfinished in places, and rest easy inside it anyway. Conclusion. The current was always here. We began by asking why two people, standing in the very same city, could live such different lives. By now, the answer should feel less like a mystery and more like something you always half knew, waiting only to be named. It was never about luck. It was never about who started with more. It was the brothers who chose to dig instead of wait, the lighthouse keeper who kept his light burning instead of chasing ships, the architect who refused to build without a clear picture first, the spring that gave freely and was never empty because of it. Egypt named this law in temple stone. Rome practiced it in quiet daily discipline. A forgotten manuscript, written in 1910, tried to put it into plain, practical words for anyone willing to read them. Tonight, it has been named for you again. The current
was never far away. It was beneath you the entire time, patient, indifferent to how long you took to notice it, ready the moment you finally turned to walk with it instead of against it. But there is a second law, older still and far less understood, that governs not wealth, but vitality, the hidden current that decides why some people seem to radiate energy long into old age, while others, in the prime of life, feel already spent. That current belongs to another journey, one we will walk together soon.